Good morning. It is great to spend this moment with you this morning. Welcome to all of you who are here today, and welcome also to those who are with us online. I love that song. It's one of my all-time favorites, and it really just gets me excited to share the news that we have in Jesus with you today. I'm glad that you're here this morning. Glad to be with you today. So recently I learned that in Korean culture there is something called a dul. That's D-O-L, short for duljanchi. I really hope I pronounced that right, but I'm pretty certain I probably did not. But basically what it is a baby's first birthday party, only they make it to be a really big deal. So some families will rent out a wedding venue or a banquet hall even, and everybody that you know is invited to this party, and often there's music and dancing. Sometimes they give out door prizes to the guests who come. Always there is an abundance of food, as you can see in this picture. I think this 1-year-old baby has enough to eat here with this spread. I think I would be pleased with that spread on my birthday. And then the highlight, really the centerpiece of the duljanchi, is the duljabi, which is this really old tradition, and it goes like this. So a cloth is spread out before the birthday boy or girl, and maybe the mother's holding the child at this time. And then they take and they put these things, like certain items, on the cloth. Things like maybe they put a paintbrush on the cloth for an artist. And maybe they take a tennis ball and put it there on the cloth for an athlete, or a pencil for someone who's studious and intellectual. Usually they'll put a stack of money down on the cloth for someone who's wealthy. Very often they take a long white string and put it on the cloth for a long life lived. And you could go on with this and personalize this in any which way you want. A stethoscope, a microphone. They put these things that represent some possible future. And they take all these things and lay them down on the cloth, and then they set the birthday boy or girl down on that cloth. And the tradition is, a lot of people just do this for fun, but the tradition is that whichever of those items that the baby crawls to and picks up first, that's what their life will be like. That's what the future holds for them. I was watching I got a picture of that here as well. I was watching a TV show recently, and this tradition came up. I had never encountered it before. Maybe some of you have. Has anybody ever heard or seen one of these ceremonies before? Okay, a couple hands, just a few hands here. Well, the person in the TV show was like I am. He had been invited by his girlfriend to come to this birthday party, but he's kind of new to Korean culture, and so he had no idea about any of these things that were happening before him. And so there were these family members standing beside, and they were sort of explaining these things to him as they set the baby down on the cloth. And at first she just kind of sits there, and then she starts crawling toward that line of items, and an older man in the family is saying to this newcomer, now she's going to choose her future. And there's a little girl there also. She's probably 5 or 6 years old. And she says to the newcomer, I would pick the long white string, like long life. What would you choose? And the newcomer is sort of taking all of this in. And he says, so you can only choose one? And that question in that moment kind of really struck a chord with me. It got me thinking about, our present and our future and what they hold for us, which is a pretty common thing, I think, to be thinking about. Those questions of what do I want to do with my life? Or what kind of person do I want to be looking forward? Or at other times, maybe we look back and say, what kind of person have I been? Those are questions that we feel and we think about, or at least I do, from time to time. And it reminds me of our passage for today from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're getting back into Ecclesiastes today. It's our third week in this book of wisdom. And in the third chapter, the wisdom that this book gives us is wisdom about time. Randall read the passage we're going to focus on just a moment ago. And for most people, I imagine for some of you, this is probably your favorite part of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's easy to see why, because here we have this beautiful poem, really, about time. And it just immediately strikes us as so true because we've lived this, haven't we? But the thing that I want to say today is that not only is this a beautiful and true passage, like this is what time is like, but also this passage sheds light on those questions that we feel like, what will I do? What kind of person will I be? What does life really hold in store for us? So what does this passage have to say to us then? Verse 1. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search, a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent, a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And this is what Ecclesiastes says to us about time. And you don't have to be a poetry expert to see that it's giving us a whole bunch of opposites, right? And we had birth and death, we had planting and uprooting, we had building and tearing down, we have laughter and we have weeping. So it's giving us all of these different little pairs of opposite things. But what are all of these little opposite things that there is a time for in life? What are they saying about the way we live our lives? What does it mean to us that there is a time for everything? Well, one thing it might mean for you is that your life will almost certainly not be just one thing. Our lives, like the calendar, are filled with seasons, and seasons, as we know, they come and they go and they come back again. Some of them, like August, don't go as quickly as we want them to, but they come and they go and they change and they change and they change. And our lives are like that too. Our lives are filled with seasons. And so to go back to that question that the man was asking in our story earlier, we are not just locked into this one thing that our lives can do and be. Like that's just all that it can be, as if the person you are now is all that you'll ever be. Or the interests and the passions you have now are all that you'll ever have, and the path that you choose now or the one that you chose long ago about school and life and jobs, and your lifestyle is just an open and shut thing that can never change. That's not it at all. And the struggles we have now, like with COVID, or with faith, or with sin, or in our relationships, those struggles do not necessarily have to hang over us forever. For everything there is a season. And some of those seasons may be harder than others. Some of them may be just a joy. But the very fact of our changing seasons is evidence to us that our lives are filled with and able to change. That's really important. Especially when we feel sort of locked into or kind of stuck in our struggles or our disappointments or our mistakes or our sorrows, as if they're the only thing that our life can be. Ecclesiastes says to us in those times, there is a time for everything. However, what it does not say to us is that there is time for everything. Now, it may sound like I'm repeating myself, or maybe that I've lost my mind, but the passage says there is a time for everything, meaning all those things we just talked about. Life changes, and your life can be more than just one thing. But saying there is a time for everything and there is time for everything, those are two very different things to say. And maybe that's part of what that Korean tradition we were talking about is meant to teach. So on the one hand, we may not be locked into this one and only thing we can do and be, but on the other hand, we cannot be and do everything. Our life and our time is just simply not like that. Our life and our time is limited. We are not promised that there will always be more of it, more time. Time for everything. So what does that mean for us then? If you're not just locked in to be and do one thing, like life can change, but on the other hand, you cannot be and do everything. Life is limited. Our time is not unending. What does that mean for the way that we live our lives? Think about our future. If there is a time for everything, but not time for everything, what that says to me is that timing is everything. Timing is everything. Meaning, one of the best things you can do in your life is try to understand what kind of time you're living in. Isn't that what wisdom is? Wisdom is knowing what time it is, what kind of season of life this is, and then making the most of the time that you're in to seek those things that really matter. So if that's the kind of thing this passage is leading us toward, then maybe the questions we ought to be asking ourselves as we read it are things like, what is this a time for in my life? What kind of season am I living in? There may be things about this time or this season that we cannot change or control, but what is this time teaching me about the things that matter most? How is this season shaping me? I give a couple of examples. So one of them is this a season for laughing or weeping? And if I act as if it's one, and in fact it's the other, could I maybe miss what this time in my life is meant to do to shape me and to teach me? Is this a time for planting? Makes us think of new beginnings, new plans, new things. Or is it a time for uprooting old things, old ways, old plans, things that need to be given up or changed? Kind of important to see the difference, right? You know, the thing about planting is that it often really inevitably involves waiting. And you can trust me on that. I've lived in the suburbs my whole life. But even a farmer would tell you that, right? You plant a seed, it takes waiting in order for it to grow. Waiting is one of those hardest things for me to do. But if it's a season for planting and waiting, understanding that could mean learning patience and hope and trust. And not understanding that could mean disappointment and frustration, even bitterness. There's a time for each of these things. The difference may be in knowing what this is a time for. Or think about it with the other thing here, uprooting. That can be difficult too, because to uproot something is to know that something needs to change and to actually make that change. And very often that means sacrifice or the loss of something that was planted, maybe for a reason. It can be sacrificial and you feel loss. But it also can create a space for new things, new life, new hope to grow. You see what I'm saying with this? The question we keep asking with each and every one of these lines is, what is this a time for in your life? And not only that, but the second question is, how do we respond to that? Like, how can I live now to make the most of this time that I'm in? This timing is everything. And if we cannot be and do everything, and if we cannot even always control the time or the season that we're in, we can, however, we need to, however, use our time well to seek what matters most. This is what Scripture calls, in some of the older translations, redeeming the time, or making most of the time. Making the most of the time is another way of putting it that Ecclesiastes chapter 5 brings to us. And Paul says that's what living wisely is. He says, look carefully how you walk. Be wise about it. It means understanding what this is a time for and making the most of it, seeking what matters most. And this is something that Jesus himself was really a master of. In fact, I find it really just incredible how fitting Jesus' life is in embodying the wisdom of what we just read in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, think about this for a second with me. We're told in Scripture that Jesus was born. His birth took place when the fullness of time had come. Meaning at just the right time for God's plans, God's purposes. Christ entered the world. He was born, the fullness of time. And much like that, his death, which Jesus very often called his hour, you say things like, my hour has not yet come. Jesus' death also, like his birth, comes at just the right time. And in between those things, his birth and his death, Jesus lived at every part of his life as someone who understood what this was a time for and tried to make the most of it. So sometimes that meant for Jesus rejoicing. Like he does in Luke 10 when the disciples come back and they've been proclaiming the gospel far and wide, and he rejoices. He takes joy in the Lord in what they have done. Other times that means weeping, like we know he did in the garden, or like he did at the tomb of his friend Lazarus in John chapter 11. Jesus knew the time for each of these. Jesus knew the time to embrace. Like, think about the times when he welcomed in the tax collectors or the sinners or the poor in hopes that they might feel God's love and be motivated to seek God in their lives. But at other times, sometimes with some of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he kind of seems to refrain from embracing at least their actions in hopes that he might challenge what they're doing so that they too might seek God in their lives, just the same as before. Jesus knew the time for each of those. Jesus sowed the seeds of the kingdom even as he was uprooting some of the things that came before it. Jesus, his body like a glorious temple, was torn down and built up again after 3 days. Jesus spoke the good news And he spoke the truth to those who needed to hear it, and yet he was silent before his accusers, like a sheep before its shearers is silent. Time and time again, he said, "My hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come," until it did. And then, knowing what mattered most, and knowing what time it was for him, he took up the cross, and he was killed that we might be healed. He was mourned over that we might have reason to dance. He was mocked in hate that we might know his love. He waged war against sin to make peace with God. And Ecclesiastes says there is a time for everything. Well, in Jesus, we see the person whose timing was everything. Everything for us. Because he knew what we needed. And he loved us. And he knew when the time was right. And at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. One last thing, and I'll be done for today. It's not a song this week. We've had 2 weeks in a row where we've had a famous song. We're not going to do one of those this week. If only there was a song that famously used the words of this passage, but too bad. The last thing I want to say is about the person in this picture here. Her name is Marina Mabry. It's the one on the left, the athlete there. She's a pro basketball player, actually a local one for the Dallas Wings who play in the WNBA. Marina is 25 years old, born September 14th, 1996. And I tell you, more and more professional athletes are younger than I am, and it really makes me sad. I guess there's a time for everything. That's not why I'm talking about this. Last Saturday, a week ago Saturday, Marina Mabry was doing a post-game interview after her game, and she broke down crying in front of the room. And she just had a really great game. She came off the bench and scored 21 points, and it couldn't have come at a better time because this was the game to decide who would make the playoffs between these two teams. They won by 1 point, and it just couldn't have been a better time to have a big game in this big moment. You can imagine why that would be just like a really emotional thing. That's not why she was crying, though. She was crying because someone asked her about growing up near Manhattan. So last Saturday, a week ago, was September 11th, 2021. And 20 years ago on that day, Marina Mabry was in kindergarten. Her mother worked in finance in the first of the two twin towers, the World Trade Centers. Her kindergarten teacher that morning, when they dismissed the classes early, told them that something had happened at the World Trade Centers, and Marina knows that's where my mom works. But the phones are jammed, and you can't get word through. It's hard to even get anywhere in the city. There's no way to get word back home. It wasn't until late that night that Marina saw her mom opening the door, safe and sound. She had in her hand a little pink jacket, one that her kindergarten-aged daughter had had her eye on for weeks and weeks. She was born September 14th, and on her way to work that day, her mom stopped by the store to pick up this jacket for her daughter. Needless to say, she got her present early, unwrapped, but just what she needed. Timing is everything. And though none of us may know with full certainty what the times in our lives may hold, all of us are invited to try as we can to understand the time that we have, to understand it as the gift that it is, and also to try as we can each and every day to live that day seeking what really matters the most. In Christ, God has shown us that, what matters most.